So this is my Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker Commander deck, and this is a mono-black creature recursion deck which is built around lockdown strategies. And I built this deck because after playing Commander for a while and playing a whole bunch of different decks, you start to realize that a lot of your decks start to look the same because you're always sort of gravitating towards those staples. You always want to run the card that does its job the best. So when you play with a general like Shirei, he encourages you to not just play with the same old cards, he encourages you to play with a specific subset of creatures. So in this case, creatures with power 1 or less. And he gives you a very powerful effect if you limit yourself to that subset of creatures. So when you're playing, a tribal deck or a deck like Shirei, then you're really sort of looking outside the box because your general sort of mandates that. And the result is that you get to play with some very cool cards that you normally wouldn't see in other decks. The other thing that's cool about Shirei is that he triggers at the end of each end step, so he's sort of, built for multiplayer in that the more players at the table, the more triggers you get, and the more out of hand he can get. So there's lots of different ways to build a Shirei deck. I think the most common way is to sort of abuse come into play abilities and use a lot of sacrifice effects. And I think one of the most natural progressions of this is a lockdown deck, because, you get stuff like Grave Pact, Sadistic Hypnotist, Contamination Braids. Unfortunately, the best ways to abuse this involve sort of griefing your opponents. But, it's a legitimate strategy, and it works really well in this deck. You can definitely build a friendly version of Shirei if you want, but, it's not as fun. So first I want to talk about the general himself. Shirei is a mono-black general, which means we're going to have access to excellent tutoring, very good card draw, hand disruption, and spot removal, but, not very good artifact and enchantment heat. But generally mono-black is considered very workable in Commander. His ability here is what the deck is built on, so whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard, you may return that creature card to play under your control at end of turn if Shirei is still in play. So that last part is the significant thing, because if someone's able to kill Shirei before the end of your turn, then all of those creatures you just sacrificed aren't going to come back. So that is sort of the number one weakness of any Shirei deck. You need to protect this general at all costs, because you're sort of setting yourself up for a big loss if someone's able to kill him. So protecting him is sort of a big deal, and keeping him on the battlefield can generally be kind of a challenge. He does cost 5 mana, and he's only a 2/2, so if you get to the point where you're having to recast him for 9 or 11 mana, then you're in trouble, because generally a Shirei deck doesn't work so well without Shirei in play, so it's a very general dependent deck. So yeah, the weaknesses you need to overcome here are protecting Shirei, making sure that he doesn't get killed too often, and once you've pulled that off, you've got a million ways to abuse his ability here. So yeah, I'll take you through the creatures in this deck, and you'll see just how good his ability is. So the first batch of creatures I'm going to look at are creatures which destroy my opponent's creatures when they come into play or leave play. And that's one of the ways I lock my opponents out of the game. I keep recurring these creatures to stop them from building up any sort of board presence. So this first one here, Bone Shredder, is pretty perfect for this deck, because he has 1 power, so he works with the general, and he has Echo. And Echo is pretty good in this deck because it's basically a built-in sack outlet. And this deck is very reliant on sack outlets, so I can just let him die, and then he'll come back at the end of turn. Big Game Hunter is another 1-power creature that destroys something when it comes into play. Destroy a target creature with power 4 or greater. That means you can actually destroy black creatures, which is pretty important for a black deck. And you'll find that a lot of the creatures that you want to destroy usually have 4 power or more. Duplicant, he does not have 1 power, so why is he in this deck? Well, he's pretty awesome all on his own. It belongs in almost any deck just as a way to exile creatures and provide a very threatening board presence. But as you'll see later, this deck actually has a sub-theme of artifact recursion, so I actually can abuse Duplicant pretty consistently and bring him back a lot. So he's just another really good creature that works in any deck. Abyssal Gatekeeper, this is one that will force my opponents to sacrifice creatures when it dies. So this will actually act as a sack outlet for my other creatures and get some of my other interactions going. Shriekmaw, another creature that doesn't have 1 power, but still works in this deck just because it is a creature-based deck and it is a recursion deck. I don't have as many ways to abuse him, but every deck that's black needs some sort of go for the throat or terror effect just to sort of kill early generals that really can't stay on the board for too long. Braid's Cabal Minion. This is one of the real assholes in this deck. No one wants to play against this card, and I kind of feel bad running it, but it's just so good. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, creature, or land. And you can imagine why this is good in this deck. The creatures that sacrifice are just going to bounce back at the end of turn, and they're going to get their come into play ability again. I can also sacrifice Braids and then figure out a way to just bring it back before the end of my turn. Basically, I'm never going to suffer from her drawback, and everybody else is. So she's going to cause huge problems, and she's one of the best lockdown creatures in the deck. This next group of creatures I'm going to look at focus on destroying my opponent's hands. And that's the second way that this deck locks my opponents out of the game, by stopping them from playing with the cards in their hands. This first one here, Mesmeric Fiend, he is a 1-power creature, so he will work with the general. And when he comes into play, target opponent reveals his or her hand. You can choose an online card and remove it from the game, and then when he dies, they get that card back. So this guy's not that great on his own, but the idea is that you play him and then sacrifice him before his come into play ability resolves. So that way his leaves play ability will resolve first, and then when you resolve his come into play ability, the card will be gone for good. So because this deck runs so many sack outlets, it's pretty easy to abuse that, and then bring him back every turn and pull that off over and over and over. So usually you're going to focus fire this ability on one opponent and just completely destroy their hand, and it's very hard to stop this combo. This next one here, well, he's one of the guys you can combo with Mesmeric Fiend. Nezumi Bone Reader lets you sacrifice creatures to force players to discard cards. He himself is another 1/1, so he's going to be difficult to remove if Shirei is out. And yeah, just a straight up sack outlet who works with the lockdown theme. And then this guy here, Sadistic Hypnotist, one of the other assholes in this deck. He's probably about as nasty as Braids, if not worse. He's one of the sort of unsung heroes in Commander because he only really works well in a handful of decks, but when he works well, he works really well. So he's a 2/2, so he doesn't come back with Shirei, which is, you know, that's just merciful. It would be really unfair if he were a 1/1. But yeah, sacrifice a creature, target player discards 2 cards from his or her hand. So he is a sack outlet, which this deck is very dependent on, and 2 cards at a time is just really nasty. Usually when you play Sadistic Hypnotist, you're going to destroy everyone's hands within a couple turns. The fact that you can only use the ability as a sorcery is going to stop you from abusing him at the end of opponents' turns. But generally, you're going to have enough creatures out to destroy at least a couple players' hands the turn he comes out. So this next group of creatures focus on recursion. We can't completely rely on Shirei for all of our recursion because he does get killed, and if you lose creatures, you need some way to bring them back. So this first one here, Cadaver Imp, a 1/1 creature, so he's going to work with our general, and pretty simple, when he enters the battlefield, you may return to a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So he's going to help you recur creatures who might not be 1/1s, or creatures who might have died when Shirei was not in play. Then this one, Coffin Queen, another 1/1 creature, and she's going to make sure that you've always got access to the biggest creature in anyone's graveyard. So this is one way you can get access to a Terastodon or a Consecrated Sphinx, or something really disgusting that you might not have access to in your colors. Unfortunately, when she becomes untapped or when she dies, the creature becomes exiled, so you can't use her as sort of a pseudo-sack outlet and bring those creatures back permanently. Hell's Caretaker, another 1/1 creature, and you can sacrifice him to put creatures from your graveyard into play. You can only use him during your upkeep though, so you can't use him during your opponent's turns to do any sort of instant speed tricks. And then this one, Apprentice Necromancer, another 1/1 creature, and he has a very interesting ability here. You can tap and sacrifice him to return creature cards from your graveyard to play, and he gains haste, and at end of turn sacrifice that creature. So Apprentice Necromancer is going to bounce back at end of turn because of Shirei, and if you targeted a 1/1 creature, then that creature is going to bounce back at end of turn as well, and stay into play permanently. So it's a very interesting interaction between Shirei and Apprentice Necromancer, and there's all sorts of interesting combos and stuff you can pull off with this guy. All three of these creatures here, Apprentice Necromancer, Hell's Caretaker, and Coffin Queen, they all acquire tap abilities, so you might actually benefit from running a 1,000-year elixir, or you're definitely going to want Lightning Greaves, but for the Shroud mostly. So yeah, the lack of haste on these creatures is going to prevent you from really abusing them, but they're definitely solid anyways. This next batch of creatures give me access to some mana. Pilgrim's Eye, just a 1/1 for 1. When he comes into play, I can get a basic land, put it into my hand. He doesn't accelerate me specifically, but if I abuse him enough, then I'm going to guarantee swamp drops every turn, which is definitely important for this deck. Solemn Simulacrum, he's not a 1/1, but imagine how broken he would be if he were. So despite that fact, I'm still going to run him because I do have ways to abuse artifact creatures, so I can potentially recur him over and over again. And I do have ways to make his power smaller, so he's potentially recurable. But in any case, I'm just going to run him because he's a really solid creature in a deck with lots of sack outlets and recursion engines. And because this deck is really hurting for mana excel, unfortunately as a mono black deck, it can't really abuse Cage Sun and Gauntlet of Power. And then Arcana Revenant is just going to give us access to a doubling mana source. It's also going to be one of our few win conditions in the deck. So like I said before, there is an artifact recursion theme in this deck. These two here, Junk Diver and Mirror Retriever, basically the same creature. They're both 1/1s, so they're going to bounce back with Shirei. And when they're put into a graveyard, return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So I can use these to abuse Duplicant or Solemn Simulacrum, or something like a Pilgrim's Eye, or my extra Planar Lens. But one of the deadliest things I can do with this is recur Mindslaver over and over again, which your opponents might not like, but it's a pretty effective way to end the game, that's for sure. Scarecrow, a very good creature in Shirei, because he's got the artifact creature recursion, and I don't even have to sacrifice him to do it. I can just keep tapping him to abuse Duplicant or something. And then he also has the ability to sacrifice himself to draw cards, and because he's a 1/2, he's going to keep bouncing back at the end of each opponent's turn. So that's a lot of cards if I have the mana open. And Mindless Automaton sort of works the same way, because I can remove 2+1/+1 counters from him to draw a card, and then he dies as a 0/0. So at the end of each player's turn, I'm going to remove those counters and get an extra card. So some huge card advantage here between Scarecrow and a Mindless Automaton. And this next batch of creatures is just some random sack outlets. This deck really thrives on sack outlets, so it's important to have lots of these. These first two here are both 1/1 creatures, so they will be protected by Shirei. Viscera Seer, a free sack outlet to scry 1. If I have a ton of 1/1 creatures, then I can really fix my draws pretty well. Thought Picker Witch, one of the really nasty cards in this deck. So she's a sack outlet, not a free one, but another way I can lock my opponents out of the game, just by fate sealing them every single turn and making sure they're always drawing lands. So if I have a ton of creatures out and lots of opponent end steps to sacrifice creatures, then I can make sure none of my opponents are ever going to draw that Path to Exile that they really need. And then Dimir Houseguard, he's always a good utility creature. A free sack outlet is always nice, and Transmute means he acts as another tutor in this deck. So at the 4 casting cost slot, he's going to get stuff like Infernal Darkness, Grave Pact, Damnation, Braids, Solemn Simulacrum, Mindless Automaton. So he's going to get some card draw, sweepers, lockout cards, combo cards, and he's a free sack outlet on top of that. So definitely a good utility creature. And rounding out the creatures, I've got a couple random ones here. Graveborn Muse is just a solid card because it's Phyrexian Arena on this deck. I can't even remember if there are any other zombies in this deck. She might be the only one. Sorceress Queen. This card is a 1/1 creature, so she's going to get protected by Shirei, and her ability here is kind of random. Tap her to make any other creature a 0/2. So you can use this as sort of a defensive ability to make sure you're always going to win in combat, although I guess most of my creatures can't kill 0/2s. Anyways, the cool thing about this is that I can use this to turn my non-1/1 creatures into 0/2s. So Braid's Cabal Minion, for example, is going to die if someone kills her, and she won't come back with Shirei. But if I respond by making her 0/2, then she will. So this is going to combo stuff like Shriekmaw, Duplicant, Braid, Sadistic Hypnotist, Gravebone Muse, all these cards that normally wouldn't bounce back with my general. So this is a very interesting ability in this deck, and definitely worth trying. So now we're getting into the non-creature cards, and I'm going to start off with the lockout cards, because like I said, this deck is built around locking my opponents out of the game and denying them their resources. So this first one here, Grave Pact. Whenever any creature I control goes into a graveyard, each other player sacrifices a creature. So you can imagine the nature of this deck, that I'm going to keep all of my opponent's creatures off the table once I have Grave Pact out. And my creatures are going to keep bouncing back, but theirs won't. So this is just effectively going to stop them from keeping anything on the board. Then these two are very similar, Infernal Darkness and Contamination. They're both going to make all lands produce black, so any non-black player is just going to be completely shut out of the game. They're a bit different with their cumulative upkeeps. Contamination lets me sacrifice creatures to pay the upkeep, and as you can imagine, that works very well in this deck because they're going to keep bouncing back. So I can keep Contamination up indefinitely, basically. And unless someone has an answer on the table or some unique way to deal with him, Contamination tends to just end the game on its own. Infernal Darkness requires a mana upkeep, so I can't keep this out indefinitely, but with the time I buy keeping this on the table, I can usually get some tutor something up, keep Sadistic Hypnotist out, and destroy my opponent's hands, and by the time they finally get rid of it, I'll have established a pretty massive advantage. And then Mindslaver, like I said, I have lots of ways to turn this into a lock with Junk Diver and Mirror Retriever, and with lots of mana I can definitely pull off a lock with this and get one player out of the game at least. So as I mentioned before, this deck's biggest weakness is people who are smart enough to know when and how to kill Shirei, because if they kill him right after I sacrifice all my creatures, then I'm not getting any of those guys back. So it's really important that you protect him. So stuff like Lightning Greaves is crucial because of the Shroud and the free equip cost. The haste is actually really handy because I've got a lot of creatures with tap abilities, so that helps a lot. Darksteel Plate just gives him indestructibility, so that's going to protect him from wrath effects, and it's a pretty hard card to remove itself. Imp's Mischief, kind of a random card in black, gives you access to some unexpected redirection. Shirei is going to get the target of Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares a lot, so this is one way you can sort of keep those spells off of him. Of course, you can always redirect a Time Stretch or some ridiculous card like that, but that's generally not the idea of this card. It's just to sort of protect him from paths and stuff. So a couple more sack outlets here. Attrition here is sort of another Grave Pact type effect. I can sacrifice creatures to destroy non-black creatures. And Ashnod's Altar, this one's pretty handy because it's a free sack outlet, and it lets me turn my creatures into mana. So I don't have any other ways to turn creatures into mana, and this is pretty handy because Shirei's going to die a lot, and because his initial cast is 5 mana, his respawn tax can definitely get pretty high. So this is one way I can pay for his respawn tax, just by turning my creatures into 2 colorless mana. Next we've got some straight up hand disruption, and this is a really powerful effect for mono black because it's one of the few ways you can sort of deal with instants and sorceries without having to play counter spells that you don't have access to. So you're probably going to point this at the player who keeps killing Shirei, whoever has the biggest grip of cards that are most likely to disrupt your combos and lockdowns. So we have Mind Twist, really efficient card, just a black and X, and then Mind Sludge, which is going to work very well with all the swamps we have. Here's some random goodies. We've got Living Death, which is going to work well in any black creature-based deck, so it's going to swap all the creatures in play with creatures in graveyards. This sort of mass recursion definitely has some interesting possibilities. If you somehow let Shirei go into your graveyard, then this is a smart way to bring him back. And of course it acts as a pseudo wrath effect. If your opponents don't have anything in their graveyard, then this is just a damnation for them. Profane Command, just a very versatile card because all of these abilities are going to end up being useful. We love recursion and we love spot removal, but because this deck is so light on win conditions, the fireball type effect to the opponent's face is going to come in handy more often than not. And then Soren Markov, probably the only card in the deck which is a dedicated win condition. There are very few ways this deck focuses on ending the game. Usually it just gets my opponents to scoop, but this is one way I can sort of aggressively set someone's life total down to 10, and then hopefully chip away with some of my 1/1 creatures. The other two abilities are potentially useful as well. I've got some spot removal and another Mindslaver effect there. Next we've got our sweepers. Black is always good at creature removal. So Damnation is always a solid choice, just destroys all creatures for 4 mana. Mutilate works just as well. Ashes to Ashes, a very handy card in black from the dark. Removes 2 target non-artifact creatures from the game and deals 5 damage to you. So it can hit black creatures, and it actually exiles creatures. So that's 2 difficult things that black usually has trouble with. Decree of Pain is just one of the nastiest cards in black. Destroy all creatures and then draw a card for each creature destroyed this way. That is one of the biggest card advantage swings in this format, especially when you've got a massive creature grip-based deck like this one. So usually you're okay sacrificing your own creatures because you're going to find some way to bring them back eventually. The cycling is just really handy for killing Azami decks, or there's a whole bunch of generals that happen to have 2 power, so that works really well. Then Oblivion Stone and All Is Dust, 2 colorless sweeper effects that will give me a way to deal with artifacts and enchantments. Black does not have too many ways to deal with those, so these are my outs for those. Definitely good tutor targets. I'm not a big fan of Nevinul's Disc because it comes into play tapped, so these 2 will work just as well. Better, usually. Next we have some card draw. Black always has some really solid card draw options. Sensei's Divining Top will find its way into any deck. Skull Clamp will usually find its way into any small creature-based deck. The important thing to note about Skull Clamp is that it unfortunately gives the creature an extra piece of power, which means it's going to be a complete non-combo with Shirei. So it's going to turn 1/1 creatures into 0/2s, so they won't bounce back with my general. Despite that poor synergy, it's just too good to pass up. Phyrexian Arena, an extra card each turn, always a solid choice. Promise of Power, 5 cards for 5 mana, is better than a lot of other cards in this format, so don't overlook this one. And then Necropotence, just one of the best ban-worthy cards in this format that still hasn't become banned. Draw as many cards as you want for 3 mana. Seems pretty fun. Next we have the absolute best reason to play black in EDH, Tutors. Tutors are so amazing in any singleton format because this is going to give you access to your silver bullets like Braids and Mindslaver and Sadistic Hypnotist, cards which you really rely on but you only have 1 copy of. So Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor, extremely efficient cards. Diabolic Intent, one of those cards that probably gets overlooked more than it should be. It's actually just a Demonic Tutor with a sack outlet. And a deck like this, which thrives on sack outlets and has a ton of creatures and abuses graveyard recursion, this could potentially be better than Demonic Tutor in some situations. But mostly it's just a really efficient tutor. Beseech the Queen and Diabolic Tutor, 2 very playable cards. Liliana Vess, one of those nice possibly repeatable tutors. The cool thing about Liliana is that we're actually going to potentially use that last ability in this deck because we're so light on win conditions. One of the things we can do is lock our opponent's resources out of the game and then slowly build her up to that ultimate and then use that to win the game. So she's actually pretty good in this deck. Expedition Map. This will find its way into a lot of black decks because Cabal Coffers is broken. And this deck actually has a lot of really nifty non-basic lands, so Expedition Map is going to work really well. And then Citadel Flute, one of those overlooked cards, because it seems like it's going to be a huge mana investment at 5 mana, and then you're paying X every turn, but this deck is built on really cheap creatures, a lot of 1 and 2 cast and cost cards. So sticking this on the table, usually people won't feel too threatened by it, until they realize the kind of advantage you're building off of this. So one of those really underrated cards. You're going to want to look at this for, Edric Spymaster decks, Shirei or Elf decks. This actually works really well, especially in Shirei. And the last 2 cards here are Mana Rocks. We've just got a Soul Ring and an extra Planar Lens. Pretty pathetic. This deck could probably use a couple more Mana Rocks. I'm thinking Ran Dynamo or Gilded Lotus or something. The reason we're only using extraplanar lands is because Cage, Sun, and Gauntlet of Power unfortunately give my creatures extra power, which means they don't work with the general. Just so you know, one of the ways that people will try to screw you over is by dropping Gauntlet of Power and naming black just to kill your general's ability, which is really douchey, but, you know, whatever. So yeah, these are one of the few ways that can actually ramp up into some mana, other than Cabal Coffers, of course, which I'll get to in a second. Onto the mana base. Most monocolor decks are going to want to go easy on the non-basics and sort of stick to basic lands to abuse stuff like Gauntlet of Power, but because we can't use Cage, Sun, and Gauntlet of Power, we can sort of go all out with the non-basics, especially because there are a lot of non-basics which work really well with this deck. So we've got 25 basic swamps, and then we've got these two, Blinkmoth Nexus and Inkmoth Nexus. These are both interesting because they turn into 1/1 creatures, so this is going to work with Sadistic Hypnotist, Thought Picker Witch, etc. So they're going to bounce back. Just give us access to 1 more creatures to use as a sack outlet. And the handy thing about these creatures is that I can actually sacrifice them to Dust Bowl as well, and then they will bounce back with Shirei. So that's sort of a interesting combo there to abuse repeatable Strip Mine effects. And then we've got Strip Mine itself. Bajuka Bog always goes in any black deck, an incredibly useful card. And we've got Cabal Coffers and the standard Cabal Coffers package. So Urborg to turn all my lands into swamps, Vesuva to copy the coffers, Petrified Field to bring it back if it gets destroyed, and Deserted Temple to untap it and reuse it. And then because we're going with a creature-based sacrifice and recursion engine strategy, we need the standard Phyrexian Tower, High Market, and Myron the Moaning Well, and then Volrath Stronghold as some extra security to bring back my creatures. So that's the deck. I didn't really take the time to go through and talk about all of the interactions in this deck, but suffice it to say there are two we need to talk about. The general pretty much combos with any 1/1 creature, especially one with a come into play ability or a sacrifice outlet, and then from then on it's just really easy to figure out how you're going to lock your opponents out of the game. So the deck is going to play like this. Usually you're going to try and get Shirei out with some sort of protection to back him up, because anyone who knows how this deck operates is going to go after your general first. They realize how important it is to keep him off the table. But if you can stick him, you're going to abuse sacrifice outlets like Thought Picker Witch, Ashnod's Altar, and recursion like Scarecrow and Cadaver Imp to keep your creatures off the board and back on the board over and over again. And then the way I've chosen to build this deck is to lock my opponents out of the game and deny them their resources. So I'm going to attack their hands. Sadistic Hypnotist is especially crucial in this deck. I'm going to keep their creatures off the board with Grave Pact, Bone Shredder, and I'm going to deny them their mana with Contamination. And then I'm just going to set up some really douchey cards like Braid's Cabal Minion and Mindslaver. Because I'm playing mono black, I have access to awesome effects like really good card draw, amazing tutors, and some really good sweeper effects, so I can definitely play the control game effectively. And then when I'm ready, I can find some way to win the game. I didn't really talk about how this deck wins, because really the main win condition is people realizing when they're beat and scooping. When you've got everyone down to no cards in hand and no creatures in play, they usually realize that it's going to be a long end, but in the end they're going to lose. If your opponents insist on playing it out, then you can kill them with a Liliana Vess ultimate, which, as I discussed before, is easier to pull off than you think. Soren Markov is a dedicated win condition. Big Profane Command or a big Narcana Revenant will also work. So that's the deck. There's a lot of very interesting ways you can build a Shirei deck, and it's a very interesting deck to play. So this is the kind of deck that really won't draw much hate until people realize what you can do with it. I know the first time this saw play at our store, people thought, oh, you built a deck around 1/1 creatures, oh, that's so bad. Then they realized that it's not fun when you've got Sadistic Hypnotist and Braids and Mindslaver out. So this is the kind of deck which will eventually build its own reputation and draw some hate. Of course, there are varying ways you can build this. You can sort of go for an aggro strategy, you can go for a more combo strategy. You can build it entirely around artifacts, which is an interesting way to go. So anyways, I hope you got some ideas from this. Maybe you'll try your own Shirei deck, and let me know if you have any ideas. So thanks for watching. Holy shit, this is starting to get out of hand.